I didn't want to play. Not at first. A grown man, 32 years old, hiding in the shadowy guts of an abandoned textile factory? It sounded ridiculous, childish. But when the team insisted, laughing and teasing, I caved. It was supposed to be fun. A break from the endless grind of project deadlines and budget cuts. A bonding exercise, they called it. The old factory was one of those urban relics that time forgot, squatting at the edge of the industrial park like a rotting giant. Its walls bore the fading scars of graffiti, its windows' shattered teeth glinting in the gray afternoon light. "You'll love it," Mark had said, his grin wide and persuasive. He was one of those people who could sell you anything, an idea, a product, or, in this case, a bad idea disguised as a team game. "We'll split into two groups. One hides, the other seeks." Simple, sure. But the factory wasn't simple. It was vast, sprawling. A labyrinth of rusting machinery, crumbling staircases, and endless hallways. The air smelled faintly of oil and mildew, a cocktail of decay and abandonment. When it was my turn to hide, I followed the others' lead and scattered. The seekers were counting loudly near the entrance, their voices echoing through the cavernous space. I wandered deeper into the factory, past the rows of ancient looms and conveyor belts, until their counting faded into a low murmur. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Every footstep sent a cascade of echoes down unseen corridors. Shadows clung to the corners, thick and unyielding. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just an old building. No ghosts or ghouls lurking in the dark. Just us, a group of co-workers playing an overgrown game of hide and seek. I found my hiding spot in a small room tucked behind a half-collapsed wall. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, scraps of metal, chunks of plaster. I crouched behind a rusted cabinet, heart thudding in my chest, ears straining for the sound of approaching footsteps. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The air grew colder, or maybe it just felt that way because I wasn't moving. I shifted slightly, trying to ease the cramp forming in my legs, and froze when a metallic clang echoed nearby. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone tapping metal on metal. My first thought was that it must be one of the seekers trying to flush out the hiders. But the sound didn't come from the direction of the entrance. It came from deeper within the factory, where no one had gone. I debated leaving my hiding spot, weighing the risks. If it was one of my coworkers, I'd lose the game. But if it wasn't, my pulse quickened at the thought. I reminded myself there was nothing to be afraid of. Just an old building, just a game. The tapping continued, growing louder and more erratic. It was joined by another sound. A low, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My throat tightened. I couldn't sit still any longer. I rose carefully, stepping around the debris, and peered around the edge of the cabinet. The room beyond my hiding spot was empty, its doorway yawning into darkness. The sounds had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. I edged out cautiously, every nerve on high alert. The factory seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I crept down the hallway, back toward the central area where the others had started. My footsteps sounded impossibly loud, each one a betrayal. As I turned a corner, I nearly collided with Sarah. She looked as startled as I felt, her wide eyes scanning the shadows behind me. "Did you hear it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She gestured for me to follow her, and we moved together, silent and tense. We found Mark and two others huddled near the base of a massive loom. They looked relieved to see us, but their expressions quickly turned serious. Mark explained, his tone hushed, that they'd heard the noises too. Not just the tapping and scraping, but faint whispers, as if someone or something was moving through the factory. We decided to regroup and leave. The game no longer felt like fun, felt wrong. We called out for the rest of the team, our voices bouncing back at us in distorted echoes. One by one, the others emerged from their hiding spots, drawn by the urgency in our shouts. All except for Paul. Paul was the joker of the group, always pushing boundaries, taking things too far. At first, we thought he was just hiding, refusing to come out and admit defeat. We split up again, searching for him. Each of us took a different section of the factory, promising to meet back at the entrance in 10 minutes. I headed toward the eastern wing, where the machinery was most dense. The air felt heavier there, laden with the smell of rust and oil. I called Paul's name, my voice trembling slightly, and heard nothing in response. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint hum of the wind slipping through cracks in the walls. I found his jacket first, draped over a broken chair near the edge of a collapsed staircase. It was the same jacket he'd been wearing when we started the game, unmistakable in its bright red color. My stomach twisted. He wouldn't have left it behind, not unless. The thought trailed off as I spotted something else. Footprints in the dust, leading away from the chair and into a narrow passageway. The prints were fresh, their edges crisp. I followed them, my heart hammering in my chest. The passageway ended in a large, open room I hadn't seen before. It was empty except for a single piece of machinery in the center, a massive press with jagged edges. The footprints stopped abruptly in front of it, as if their owner had vanished into thin air. I stood there, staring at the spot where the prints ended, trying to make sense of it. A faint sound reached my ears, so soft I almost missed it. Breathing. Shallow, uneven breathing, coming from somewhere nearby. I turned slowly, scanning the room, but saw nothing. My pulse raced as I backed away, keeping my eyes on the shadows. When I finally made it back to the entrance, the others were already there, their faces pale and anxious. They'd found no sign of Paul, and the factory's oppressive silence offered no clues. We called the police, our voices overlapping as we tried to explain what had happened. They searched the factory thoroughly, combing through every room and passageway, but found no trace of Paul. The only evidence he'd ever been there was his abandoned jacket and those inexplicable footprints. To this day, I don't know what happened in that factory. I don't play hide and seek anymore, and I've never set foot in a place like that again. It was supposed to be a quick game. Just one round of hide and seek before we all went back to cramming for finals. Nobody wanted to spend too much time on it, but Jamie had dared me to play, and I couldn't say no. When a group of juniors dares you to do something, you either go along or risk looking like a total loser. We chose the gym because it was big and empty. The school was dead quiet after hours, the janitors long gone, and the fluorescent lights flickered just enough to make everything feel off. I figured it'd be fine. It was just a game, right? And I'd been in the gym 100 times before. Nothing creepy about it. Jamie explained the rules like it wasn't the same hide and seek we'd played since kindergarten. He said the seeker would count to 50, and everyone else would hide anywhere in the gym or the locker rooms. He also added this dumb twist. If you got found, you had to help the seeker find the others. Like a chain reaction. I rolled my eyes, but everyone else nodded like it was genius. The others scattered when Jamie started counting. I wasn't in the mood to run, so I walked. The gym had a lot of hiding spots if you weren't picky. Behind the bleachers, under the stage, or even up in the storage loft. But I wanted something better, somewhere they'd never think to look. The locker rooms seemed like a good bet. They were dimly lit, and the smell of sweaty socks was enough to keep most people out. I slipped inside, the heavy door creaking behind me, and ducked into one of the last rows of lockers. The air was stale and cold, even colder than I expected, but I didn't think too much about it. I crouched behind a row of lockers, listening to Jamie's muffled voice finish counting. Footsteps echoed faintly as he moved through the gym, calling out in this sing-songy tone that sounded way too cheerful for the creepy vibe of the place. I tried to keep my breathing quiet, my heart thumping faster than it should have. It wasn't long before I heard someone else come into the locker room. At first, I thought it was Jamie or maybe one of the others who'd already been found. But the footsteps were weird, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was didn't care about being heard. They weren't calling out either, which was against Jamie's rules. I leaned forward slightly, peering through the narrow gap between the lockers, but I couldn't see anything. Just shadows stretching across the tiled floor. I figured it was someone trying to scare me, Jamie was big on pranks, and it would be just like him to try and freak me out. So I stayed put, hoping they'd get bored and move on. But the footsteps didn't go away. They got closer, each one louder than the last, until they stopped right near where I was hiding. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as I waited for them to move again. But they didn't. The silence dragged on, and I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just the echo of Jamie's steps from the gym. Then the lockers rattled. Not a little, like someone brushing past, but violently, like they were being kicked or shoved. I jumped, banging my head against the metal, and bit back a curse. Whoever it was, they weren't messing around. I thought about yelling, but my throat felt tight, like I couldn't get any sound out. Instead, I pressed myself against the cold metal, hoping they'd give up and leave. The rattling stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited a few seconds before risking a look. When I peeked around the edge of the lockers, the row was empty. No Jamie, no prankster, just the dim, flickering light and the hum of the air vents. I wasn't about to stick around, though. I crawled out from behind the lockers and made my way back toward the gym. The locker room door creaked when I pushed it open, and I half expected Jamie to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But the gym was empty, too. No Jamie, no other players, just rows of folded bleachers and a basketball sitting alone at center court. I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. "Jamie? Guys?" Nothing. Not even a laugh or a shuffle of footsteps. I grabbed my phone to check the time and realized I had no signal. That didn't make sense. I'd had full bars earlier. I tried to convince myself that everyone was still hiding, but it felt wrong. Too quiet, too empty. I decided to leave. If Jamie wanted to keep playing, he could do it without me. As I headed for the double doors leading to the hallway, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were coming from the bleachers. I turned, squinting into the shadows, and saw movement. A figure was crouched low, just visible between the rows of seats. "Jamie, is that you?" I called out. The figure didn't answer. It moved deeper into the shadows, out of sight. I don't know why I followed. Maybe I thought it was one of the others, or maybe I just wanted to prove I wasn't scared. Either way, I climbed up into the bleachers, the old wood creaking under my weight. The figure was fast, darting from row to row, always just ahead of me. I called out again, but they didn't stop. By the time I reached the top row, I was out of breath and out of patience. I stood there, looking around, but the figure was gone, vanished. The gym was silent again, except for the faint hum of the air vents. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. My reflection in the glass of the gym doors. Except it wasn't just my reflection. There was someone standing behind me. I spun around, but the bleachers were empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt this overwhelming urge to get out. I bolted down the bleachers, across the gym, and out into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gulping in the cool night air. Jamie and the others were there, sitting on the curb like nothing had happened. They looked at me like I was crazy when I started yelling, demanding to know why they'd left me alone. Jamie swore they'd been waiting outside the whole time, that nobody had come back into the gym. I didn't believe him, but I couldn't prove he was lying either. I don't know who or what I saw in that gym, but I've never gone back to find out. Jamie still jokes about it sometimes, calling me a chicken, but I don't care. Whatever was in there, it wasn't part of the game. It was the summer of 1962, and I was 19, full of the arrogance that comes with thinking the world owes you something just for existing. My friends and I were stuck in our little town with nothing better to do than waste time. Back then, wasting time meant cheap beer, bad jokes, and the occasional dare. That's how we ended up at the old Bradford estate, a crumbling mansion on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years, the kind of place kids made up stories about to scare each other. People said it was cursed, though nobody could agree on the details. Some claimed the family who'd lived there disappeared overnight. Others swore it was haunted by the ghosts of Civil War deserters. None of us believed a word of it. It was Danny's idea to go. He had this grin that could talk you into anything, and that night he was grinning ear to ear. "Let's make it interesting," he said, holding up a battered flashlight like it was a prize. "Hide and seek. In the dark. Last one found wins." We laughed, the kind of laugh that's more about bravado than humor. No one wanted to admit they were scared. Not Danny, not me, not Maggie or Jack. So we went along with it, filing into the house like fools walking into a trap. The place was worse than I expected. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the floors creaked with every step. Moonlight spilled through broken windows, casting jagged shadows on the walls. Danny handed me the flashlight and said I was it. He told me to count to 100 while the others hid, then grinned again and took off, his footsteps echoing down the hall. I stood in the foyer, counting slowly, my voice bouncing back at me in whispers. At 99, I opened my eyes and clicked on the flashlight. Its beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness, but it was better than nothing. I started walking, my footsteps cautious, the air growing colder with every step. The first room I checked was the parlor. It was empty except for a few sagging chairs and a grand piano with keys missing. I called out, my voice wavering just enough to annoy me. No answer. I moved on, checking the dining room, the kitchen, and a narrow hallway lined with doors. Each one creaked open to reveal nothing but dust and shadows. By the time I reached the second floor, I was starting to feel uneasy. The house seemed too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I found Maggie crouched behind an old wardrobe, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. She scowled when I told her she was out, but she followed me as I kept searching. Jack was next, hiding in what looked like a child's bedroom. He'd stuffed himself into a closet, and when I opened the door, he nearly fell out. He didn't say much, just shrugged and joined Maggie and me as we continued the search. That left Danny. We called his name, our voices echoing through the empty halls, but he didn't answer. Maggie suggested he was trying to scare us, but Jack didn't think so. "It's not like him," he said. "He'd be laughing his ass off by now." We split up again, agreeing to meet back in the foyer in 10 minutes. I took the west wing, a part of the house I hadn't explored yet. The hallway there was narrower, the air colder. My flashlight flickered, and I banged it against my palm, muttering a curse. It steadied, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The last door in the hallway led to the attic. The stairs were steep, the kind that make your knees ache just looking at them. I climbed slowly, my breath fogging in the chilly air. At the top, I found a door, its handle cold under my hand. It opened with a groan, revealing a vast, cluttered space. The attic was filled with old furniture, trunks, and boxes, their contents hidden under sheets of dust. "Danny," I called, my voice sounding small. The attic swallowed the sound. I stepped inside, sweeping the flashlight beam across the room. Shadows danced on the walls, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing, just a trick of the light. I moved further in, my footsteps stirring up clouds of dust. Then I saw it, a shoe sticking out from behind a stack of crates. I hurried over, my heart pounding, and found Danny. He was lying on the floor, his eyes open but unseeing. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted, as if he'd been about to say something. I dropped the flashlight and shook him, calling his name. He didn't respond. His body was cold, too cold, like he'd been there for hours. But that didn't make sense. We'd only been playing for 20 minutes, maybe 30. The others found me like that, kneeling next to Danny's body, my hands trembling. Maggie started crying, and Jack just stared, his face ashen. None of us knew what to do. The flashlight had rolled away, its beam flickering weakly, and in the dim light, Danny's expression seemed almost peaceful. We never told anyone what happened. We couldn't. Who would believe us? We carried Danny's body out of the house and left it on the steps of the nearest hospital, then ran. The next day, the papers said he died of a heart attack. 19 years old, healthy as a horse, and just like that, gone. I tried to forget, to move on, but the memory stayed with me. And then, last week, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find a man standing there, his face weathered but familiar. It was Danny, or someone who looked exactly like him. He smiled and said he'd been looking for me, said we had unfinished business. I slammed the door and locked it, but I've been hearing footsteps ever since. They're in the hall, on the stairs, and sometimes right outside my bedroom door. I've kept the lights on, but it doesn't help. I know he'll come back. He always does.